Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, and trends from an admittedly conservative perspective. My name is Chris Pareja, and this evening I'm joined by the founder of Jihad Watch, Robert Spencer. We're going to talk a little bit about the religion of peace, better known as Islam, and some of the myths or some of the things that need to be kind of sorted out so we can have a better understanding of really what's entailed in the religion of peace. Robert, thanks for joining us this evening.
Hey, thank you, Chris. I'm very happy to be here.
So you're a highly sought after speaker, and people try to bring you in around the country and probably other parts of the world as well. Tell me what set you off on this path of this enlightenment.
Actually, my family is from the last great Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire, and when I was growing up, my grandparents would tell me stories about life there and how wonderful it was. And then I asked the inevitable question, well then, why are you here? Why did you leave? And they said, well, we were exiled. And they couldn't actually tell me why they were exiled, or they wouldn't tell me. I was very young then. But it was something that sparked a curiosity in me, and I started reading up about the history of that region and the Ottoman Empire in general, and ultimately I discovered that they had been asked to leave because they had declined to convert to Islam, and that this was part of much larger exiles of non-Muslims from what is now Turkey in the aftermath of World War I. And that set me into a study of Islam to understand, well, what would lead people of a certain religion to want to kick out or kill all the people who were not of this religion, and started reading the Quran when I was in college. And found the whole thing fascinating, although I didn't convert. It wasn't really fascinating on that level, but fascinating just as a matter of what would compel people to believe in this, what people would find attractive in it, and so on. And kept studying it until, of course, as one thing leads to another, now this is all that I do.
So that's an interesting question. There are movements across the United States and around the world where there are major pushes to recruit people into Islam. What would encourage them to join the religion of peace?
Well, there's several things. You know, we're here by Marin County, and you may recall right after 9/11, when the U.S. troops went into Afghanistan, they found the Marin County Mujahid, John Walker Lind, a young man from this area who had grown up in a household that I think is probably rather typical of households in Marin County and many people across the country, I think left him kind of unmoored and without any sense of values or sense of what was important in life or sense of right and wrong. And here came Islam into his life with its absolute certainties about what's good and what's not, what's right and what's wrong, and a sharp rebuke to the sort of anything goes culture that he had grown up in. And I think that he found that extremely attractive, and many others like him do.
And so you're saying that instead of having the pathway of anything goes and there should be no rules because people lose self-esteem, etc., in that kind of a scenario, that actually the structure of an organized religion was attractive to him?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Islam is a complete way of life. It is not just a Sunday observance or a Friday observance in the case of Islam, not just uttering certain prayers and so on. Islam is a religion that has laws and rules for every aspect of human behavior. Now, for some people, they think that that's great because it frees them from the confusion and the uncertainty of the modern world, and sets out so that there's an answer for everything. They don't have to think, they can shut off, and they follow the rules.
But in most organized religions, the focus is on the people who are actually observing the religious values or living the religious lifestyle. Islam's a little bit different in the percentage of time spent toward people that are not of the faith. Isn't that right?
Well, Islam is tremendously concerned with unbelievers. If you read the Quran, pretty much on every page of the Quran, you can open the Quran, the holy book of Islam, to really any random page, and you will find, I guarantee you, some denunciation of the unbelievers. And the Quran is also unique among the great religious texts of the world in mandating warfare against those unbelievers and their subjugation under the rule of Islamic law. And the Quran says, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but ruthless to the unbelievers. That's chapter 48, verse 29. Now, this makes for unfortunately, quite a bit of unrest wherever Muslims and non-Muslims are together, and this has been the case throughout Islamic history.
Yeah, that seems to be a little bit of a departure from normally accepted organized religions. Go to war with people who don't believe versus try to gently persuade them to join you along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And see, this dichotomy, it runs all the way through Islam. For example, you know, in terms of Christianity, you have the New Testament where it says that God desires all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. The Quran actually says just the opposite, that God says in the Quran that if we had willed, we meaning God, if we had willed, we could have guided all men to the truth, but instead we will fill hell with jinns and men. Jinns are little spirit beings, genies. But he's saying he created people to torture them in hell, and that was their purpose. He could have guided them to the truth, but he wants them to go to hell. Now, the upshot for that is that when a pious, believing Muslim reads this, and then he sees the non-Muslims in the world, he's not taught to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He's not taught to turn the other cheek. He's taught to be harsh, ruthless to them, and to wage war until they pay the jizya, a special tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, which is also from the Quran, chapter 9, verse 29. So he views them with hatred and contempt and commits violence against them. Obviously, we have to say that not every Muslim does this any more than every Christian loves his enemies and turns the other cheek. But nonetheless, Muslims who do read these things and take them to heart as being the eternal and perfect words of Allah, they're the ones that have been problematic for the non-Muslim world all around the world today.
So what's interesting is you've said so many things that cause so many questions to float around in my head, but let's go to that concept of truth. Because what you're saying is other religions, Christianity, the Jewish faith, etc., they talk about truth. And people tend to project their view of the world on others. So we would assume, if we come from a Judeo-Christian background or others, that truth is the way that we are supposed to live our lives. But there's a little bit of a different perspective from an Islamic perspective about truth and truth within the Islamic community versus interactions outside of the community. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely, Chris. You know, you have this very sharp dichotomy between the believer and the unbeliever. And so that also carries through to the understanding of how much each should have access to the truth. Chapter 3, verse 28 of the Quran says, "Let not the believers take unbelievers as their friends and protectors, unless they are doing it to guard themselves against them." And that phrase, "unless they're doing it to guard themselves against them," has been interpreted in the Quranic commentaries by mainstream Muslim scholars whose works are read today to say that under certain circumstances one may lie to the unbelievers, deceive the unbelievers. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, said that lying was permissible. A husband could lie to his wife, and you could lie during wartime. And so when we hear these Muslim spokesmen in the United States saying the U.S. is at war with Islam, as even the head of the Council on American Islamic Relations has said, then that is what they're saying is that means it is permissible for us to lie to you. And they do. And there's deception on a grand scale. And when we, you know, it's also very important, if I may, you mentioned that people tend to think of these things from their own frame of reference. That's one of our chief downfalls. That, for example, you hear President Obama and before him President Bush, and they've both spoken at some length about the great Abrahamic faiths, and that we all have a common father in Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
But there was a departure.
There's a huge departure because, you know, when Bush talked about the great Abrahamic faiths, he was thinking of the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis says that Abraham became the father of many nations. The Quran is what Muslims read. They don't read the book of Genesis. And the Quran does not say Abraham became the father of many nations. It actually says Abraham, this is chapter 60, verse 4, Abraham is an excellent example to you when he said to his father, "There is enmity and hatred between us and you forever until you worship only Allah." And so Abraham, for the Muslims, is a model of hating the unbelievers, which is not exactly what Bush and Obama have in mind when they talk about the great Abrahamic faiths.
Right. And so, you know, the things that you've outlined about how they treat the non-believers, or people of the book, as sometimes they're termed, or kafirs, or I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. None of those behaviors that you've outlined sound very peaceful. Why would people believe that Islam is indeed the religion of peace?
Well, the people believe that Islam is a religion of peace in the first place because Muslims insist that it is, and they keep saying so. And every so often at my website, Jihad Watch, where I put up news and commentary about jihad activity, I come across a story about some Muslim head of state, the president of Pakistan or of Malaysia or Indonesia or somewhere, saying Islam is a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance and justice and so on. And this is constantly insisted upon. And so it's kind of like the repetition of it alone establishes it. But they have to keep insisting on it because it's so obviously false when Muslims, in the name of Islam, and motivated according to their own words by the texts and teachings of the Quran and Muhammad, these things, they commit violence and they justify them. It's not a religion of peace. But what they mean, these heads of state and others who say this, is in the first place the outcome. The peace that they're talking about is after the jihad warfare. When the whole world has been subdued under the rule of Islamic law, then peace will reign. And so it is a religion of peace. They just have to fight a few wars to get there.
Exterminate a few folks, and then it'll be okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's more peaceful when people don't object to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk for a second about the correlations between a couple of books that people believe in. Now, there's the Quran, and then we also have the Bible, and we have Revelations versus the idea of the return of the 12th Imam. Can you cover that slightly? And then also why, if you believe it would be uncommon for someone like Ahmadinejad to celebrate and try to bring forth the coming of the 12th Imam.
Well, you know, the 12th Imam in Shiite Islam, the Shiites are only 10 to 15% of the Muslims, but the 12th Imam in Shiite Islam is often identified with the Mahdi, which is also a figure in Sunni Islam. And they both share the idea that Jesus is going to come back at the end of the world, just as the Christians do. But the big difference is that Jesus, in the Muslim scheme of things, is a Muslim prophet who taught Islam, and his followers twisted and hijacked his teachings to create Christianity. And Jesus is going to come back in the company of the 12th Imam in Shiite eschatology, and in the company of the Mahdi, according to both the Sunnis and the Shiites. And Jesus is going to break all the crosses, kill the pigs, and abolish the jizya. Now, I mentioned the jizya before. That's the special tax that the Quran specifies that the non-Muslims have to pay to the Muslims who rule over them. And killing the pigs means that the food laws will be enforced upon the Christians, and they won't be able to eat pork anymore. And break the cross, because according to the Quran, Jesus did not die on the cross. He only seemed to. And it's an insult to Allah to say that he would allow one of his prophets to be killed in so ignominious a manner. And so Jesus is essentially going to abolish Christianity and Islamize the world. The 12th Imam makes this even more dangerous, because the 12th Imam is the savior figure of Shiite Islam. The 12th Imam is actually a historical person. In Shiite Islam, the Imams, in Sunni Islam, an Imam is like the local parish priest or the local rabbi or the local minister in the local house of worship. He's just the local Imam. But in Shiite Islam, the Imam is the successor of Muhammad. And there were 12 Imams after Muhammad. They have to be a member of Muhammad's household, that is a relative of some kind, and they share something of his prophetic power. The 12th Imam was a little kid in the 9th century who fell down a well and died. But according to Shiite eschatology, he didn't die. He's hidden in that well. Ahmadinejad used to go to the well to talk to him. The well is, the area of it is known. And he's going to come out of the well at a time when the Muslims are being persecuted more ferociously than they have ever been persecuted before. The problem with that idea is that some of the mullahs in the high command in Iran have enunciated the view that they could nuke Tel Aviv and destroy Israel and sustain retaliatory nuclear fire that could kill 10 to 15 million Iranians, and they could sustain that. You kill 10 to 15 million in Israel, it's gone. But 10 to 15 million Iranians would not only be something they could sustain, but it would be the persecution that would trigger the return of the 12th Imam. So they think by killing millions of Muslims, by bringing about the killing of millions of Muslims, they can trigger this end-time scenario, which involves the destruction of Christianity and either the murder or the conversion to Islam of all non-Muslims.
And so people who believe this are people that we should just talk to politely, and that they'll just agree with whatever we say from a political perspective, right?
You know, Chris, it's astoundingly naive that people discount this, but I think that a lot of the problem is that the people in the State Department, the people in Washington in general, they are non-religious secular types. They don't have any religion at all. They don't come from any religious background, and they tend to discount and deny the power of religious imperatives. And they don't understand. They can't even understand. They can't believe that these people take these kinds of teachings seriously. And they think, well, yes, they say that, but really we can deal with them. And, you know, the fact is that they might be able to make a deal, but it will only be a deal that will redound to the advantage of the Islamic community, and one that will further weaken the non-Muslims, because the Islamic law, which they don't care about either, stipulates that Muslims can only make a truce with non-Muslims if the non-Muslims are about to convert to Islam, or if the Muslims are weak and need time to gather strength.
And we talked about the idea of being able to lie to your enemy to further Islam anyway, so even if they commit to it, crossing your fingers is okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about this political correctness and avoiding the topic of maybe the truth about some of the aspects of Islam. How does that play out in scenarios like Fort Hood, like the Boston bombing, like what's happening in Nairobi that they're still trying to sort out?
Well, look, in Nairobi, we just have seen a terrible massacre of people where the murderers actually had a quiz, and they asked people the name of Muhammad's mother. It was Amina bint Wahab, if you're ever in this situation.
Okay.
And they asked them to recite the Islamic profession of faith, which is there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, in Arabic. And if they could do that, they would let them go. But if they couldn't, they would kill them. So they were clearly distinguishing Muslims from non-Muslims.
Everybody knows that information, though, right?
Well, then David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, immediately says, this has nothing to do with Islam. And that's generally the consensus of the world community. The mainstream media, even though they had to report that because it was part of the story, has generally downplayed it and has been calling these people militants and so on, not even terrorists, much less Islamic jihadis.
Right.
So the problem is that, you know, we might say, well, David Cameron, he doesn't want to insult the Muslims in Britain. Okay, but what are the consequences of that? We saw what the consequences of that were in Boston and at Fort Hood. At Fort Hood, we had a U.S. Army major, an Army psychiatrist, who was a Muslim, who had given abundant signs. He gave grand rounds, which is some sort of a teaching seminar that the Army psychiatrists have to give to their colleagues. And you're supposed to be, he was a psychiatrist, he was supposed to be talking about psychiatry. So there's all these Army psychiatrists in the room, and he starts talking about jihad. And everybody was shocked. Some people were very concerned. They thought that he might become violent at some point in the future.
Psychiatrists would know.
Yeah.
You'd think.
And he was in touch with Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the al-Qaeda leader, who was involved with 9/11. Two of the 9/11 hijackers went to his mosque when he was an imam in Virginia. He was involved with various other jihad attacks on the U.S. And the FBI knew this, and they didn't do anything about it. Now, not only that, but his superiors kept giving Hassan, the Fort Hood murderer, glowing recommendations and saying, even, we can learn about Islam from this man. Now, why did they do this? Why did they discount the possibility that he could be violent when it was something people were saying? Because they knew if they reported him, then they would have been pilloried for being Islamophobic, And there would have been big stories and Time and Newsweek and on CBS, Islamophobia in the military. The Council on American-Islamic Relations has called for a full investigation. All this guy was doing was expressing his Islamic faith, et cetera, and their careers would have been ruined.
Yes.
And so for political correctness, to protect those guys' careers, 13 people are dead and 30 wounded at Fort Hood.
But it was just job-place violence.
That's right. Then the Obama administration compounds the problem by insisting that this is workplace violence, denying the Purple Heart benefits and the other benefits that the relatives of the victims would receive if it were classified as terrorism, which it obviously was. And the problem is that is a vivid illustration that this denial and obfuscation, it kills.
But it was just an isolated incident, right?
Same thing happened in Boston. In Boston, the Russians informed the FBI that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was in touch with jihadis and was a jihadi himself. But the FBI the year before had stripped all of its training manuals of any mention of Islam and jihad in connection with terrorism. So they hear from the Russians, this guy's a jihadi, and they probably thought, oh, how nice. He is interested in an interior spiritual struggle to better himself.
Yes.
And they had no idea. Or if they did have any idea, they didn't dare do anything about it because, again, they would have run afoul of the politically correct police, the Council on American-Islamic Relations and others.
So since it's only okay to call Tea Partiers and Republicans terrorists,
Yeah.
What should we call these other people? I mean, is jihadi the right term? Mujahideen? What do they call themselves? And what does that mean?
Jihadis. Mujahideen or jihadis. So they're calling themselves jihadis. I think that's what we should call them.
But what does it mean?
What does it mean? That's a very important question. Jihad means struggle in Arabic, and there are many, many struggles in Arabic, just like there are many struggles in English. You can struggle to quit smoking, you can struggle to lose weight, but you can also have the titanic civilizational struggle against communism. Same word. In Arabic, you can struggle in all those different ways, but the primary meaning of the struggle of jihad in Islamic law is warfare against unbelievers, to subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law.
Wow, that doesn't sound politically correct or friendly toward non-believers.
And it is not, and it is taught in the major schools of Islamic law. It's taught in the Quran, it's taught by Muhammad. It's really a unanimous thing, and yet the denial is also unanimous.
So how do we go about, as normal citizens, helping to talk about these things in a context that would bring truth forward?
Well, we have to, I think, shed light on what the jihadis themselves do say, because they constantly cite the Quran and Muhammad to explain what they're doing and challenge Muslim communities in our own areas. How is it that you understand these passages? More importantly, what are you doing to teach your own people against this understanding of Islam you ostensibly reject? Because there is no program in any mosque in America right now to teach against Major Hassan's understanding of Islam, or Tamerlan Tsarnaev's, or Anwar al-Awlaki's. You would think that would be job one, that if they reject all that, they would be teaching against it and working against it. They aren't.
Well, we've given people a drink by the fire hose over the last few minutes. How can they find out more about you, Jihad Watch, and information that might be relevant to them as they go down this path of enlightenment as well?
Well, Chris, Jihad Watch has a website at jihadwatch.org, and it's updated many times daily with news and commentary on jihad activity. I also have 12 books. The most recent is Not Peace But a Sword, which is subtitled The Great Chasm Between Christianity and Islam. That is, a lot of people are engaged in dialogue, and they think religious dialogue will iron all this out if we just sit down and talk. And I explain some of the pitfalls of that and some of the things that the Christian side needs to know if they're going to engage in this dialogue intelligently and carefully.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing so much wisdom and your passion about Jihad Watch, and we'll try to get people connected with you so they can learn more.
Thanks, Chris.
Appreciate
it's a pleasure.
it, Robert.
Thank you.
And so at this point, we'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum.
The Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley began with 20 conservatives meeting at a restaurant in November of 2003. Our mission is to promote the principles of American liberty through education. By 2012, we had grown to over 600 paid members. Our monthly meetings feature well-known and prestigious conservative speakers addressing issues that are critical to our country's very survival. This includes speakers like Victor Davis Hanson, Andrew Breitbart, David Horowitz, and many others. In addition to our monthly meetings, we sponsor a conservative local cable access TV show, The Right Side, covering today's topics. Our Constitution discussion group not only teaches the Constitution, but started our annual essay contest that awards 2 $1,000 scholarships to local high school seniors. We are a virtual clearinghouse for grassroots organizations by providing them with table space at no charge in our exhibit area. There are typically a dozen groups represented. If you are like-minded, join us at our next meeting and become motivated and empowered. Liberty, made in America.
And welcome back to The Right Side. That was our word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum. And while we appreciate them underwriting the show and making it possible for us to bring in guests like Robert, the thing that they're most known for is their speaker series, which is why we had Robert in the studio this evening. Tonight, obviously, the speaker is Robert Spencer, the founder of Jihad Watch. But in November, Senator Jim DeMint, president of the Heritage Foundation, will be there. And also, it's going to be a special celebration because that's the 10th anniversary of the forum. In December, Michael Ramirez, a senior editor and an editorial cartoonist from Investors Business Daily, will be with us. In January, Evan Sayet, author and political satirist, will be there. And in February, the always popular Victor Davis Hanson. You can find out more at theconservativeforum.com. And if you're able to join us in person, you'll find the forum meets at 432 Stearland Road here in Mountain View, about 3 minutes away, usually on the first Tuesday of the month. And as we close, I just wanted to point out that there is a lot to know about Islam and the truth as we're told it is versus some of the things that you might find from exploring the text itself or from tapping into resources like Robert to get a fuller understanding of what the real possibilities are and the real threats that could happen if we are at risk of being too politically correct. But do the research for yourself. I'm sure you'll be intrigued. On that note, have a great evening. We appreciate you joining us. Again, this has been The Right Side, and I've been your host, Chris Pareja, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in person or on the show sometime soon. Have a great night.